I found out about the affair because of a receipt for baby clothes. It was tucked behind the sun visor of our old Suburban, folded like a secret no one expected to be discovered. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for the registration papers to renew the tag. But there it was, a crumpled receipt from a boutique in downtown Birmingham. Not the kind of place we ever shopped. Way too expensive for the kind of practical life we built. Or the life I thought we had. The kicker? The card attached to the gift said, "For the little miracle God's blessed us with." P. That P hit me in the chest like a steel toe. My wife had been seeing Pastor Lane for 6 months. At least. Long enough for them to call what they created a miracle. Long enough that he thought he could scribble that kind of note and not get caught. I didn't make a scene. Didn't storm into the church and shout her name like some wounded husband in a country song. No. I smiled through the Sunday sermons, nodded at his greasy little blessings, and took my communion like a man who didn't know his wife was sleeping with the man handing him the bread. But behind the curtain, I started pulling strings. I copied the emails she thought she deleted, pulled the photos off our family iCloud, took screenshots of her money transfers to his personal ministry PayPal account. How generous of her to tie directly to his pocket. And the DNA test, that came later, after she told me she was pregnant and hinted that we needed to rethink the finances to make room for a new arrival. That's when I stopped being passive. While she played pious and coy, I was untangling our business finances. I own 3 HVAC service companies. Nothing glamorous, just years of sweat, missed birthdays, and 110-degree crawl spaces. I restructured everything, put assets under new LLCs, transferred ownership to my cousin in Georgia temporarily, and rerouted incoming payments. On paper, I was broke. In reality, I was just out of her reach. And here's the twist, the one that still makes me shake my head. She didn't want a divorce. She wanted leverage. She sat me down one evening, back straight like she was channeling divine authority, and said she'd keep it quiet if I made it worth her while. She wanted money to keep my name clean. Said if I didn't pay, the congregation would hear about how I turned violent when I found out, how I threatened her and Pastor Lane, how I was unfit to be a father again. She figured fear would work. But fear is a funny thing. When you've already lost what mattered, you stop being afraid. I said fine. I didn't argue. I agreed to terms. She thought she won. Meanwhile, I had a USB drive and a safety deposit box, another copy mailed to a lawyer friend in Tallahassee, and one more sitting in an envelope marked, "Open if I die under suspicious circumstances." I'd made peace with the idea that justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes, it just looks like a quiet departure. But I wasn't done. Not yet. It still stuns me how calm I stayed during all of it. Maybe that's what happens when you grow up with people who smile to your face while cutting you out behind your back. You learn to keep your voice low and your eyes open. My dad used to say Southern men don't raise their voices when they're serious. They go quiet. I guess I inherited that. The day she told me she was pregnant, she looked me dead in the eye and said she hoped it would bring us closer. I remember nodding slowly, pressing my fingertips together like I was weighing the moment. I told her we'd make it work, that she didn't need to worry about a thing. That same night, I filed paperwork to shift the remainder of our shared business interests into my name only, then sold 60% of it to a silent investor I trusted more than I ever trusted her. She thought she was squeezing me, thought she had leverage. What she didn't know was that I already had the receipts. Literally. Photos of her car parked outside the pastor's counseling cabin off I-459. Screenshots of texts about praying together privately. A time-stamped purchase history from that boutique baby store. One she visited the day after she told me she was fasting and resting in the Word. It took everything in me not to throw the binder of evidence on the kitchen table and ask her who the Father really was. But I waited, because people like her, people who use God like a costume, they rely on appearances. They don't prepare for quiet men who take their time. It all came to a head when the child support order came through. A lump sum would have been cleaner, but the court went standard, monthly payments. The pastor didn't show up to the hearing. She said he was called away on a mission trip. I almost laughed right there in the courtroom. That's when I made my last move. I mailed an anonymous packet to the church board. A copy of the DNA results, the emails, photos of them holding hands behind the fellowship hall, bank transfers to his special discretionary fund. It was everything they needed to see what kind of shepherd they'd been following. They held a vote 2 weeks later. He was out. Quietly, of course, these things always are. But the fallout was not. Her phone stopped ringing. The other wives stopped inviting her to brunch. And he, well, he disappeared like mist off a windshield. No more sermons. No farewell tour. Just vanished. She found out what I'd done the day the eviction notice showed up. By then, I'd already paid off the child support obligation in one lump sum. I made sure it was enough to satisfy the courts, but not enough to live on. Just enough rope. Then I packed my bags and left Birmingham. I recognized the number as one of those old gas stations with flickering signage and bad coffee. Her voice was different, not cold, not angry. Just hollow. She asked if we could talk. Said she didn't recognize the life she was in anymore. That the walls were closing in. That he had stopped answering her messages. I didn't tell her I already knew. I'd driven by the church a few days earlier and saw the for sale sign out front. The building that had once held her pedestal now stood empty. What a symbol, I thought. All that holy noise gone silent. She tried to sound composed, but it slipped out eventually. She was being shunned. People she'd prayed beside for years now wouldn't look her in the eye. One of the women on the hospitality team told her she was no longer in spiritual alignment with the community. Church code 4. You become an embarrassment. I listened, not because I cared, but because I wanted to hear it fall apart in real time. She said she'd lost her apartment, the one the pastor had helped her get with a lease in his name. Turns out he defaulted and left her holding the bag, or in this case, the eviction notice. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. Could I help her, just until she gets on her feet? That was the first time I laughed since it all started. Not loud, not bitter, just a single, sharp breath of disbelief. I told her I'd already helped, that I'd bought her freedom for the price of silence, and walked away. I reminded her of the lump sum check she cashed with shaking hands, thinking she'd won. She said she didn't know what to do next. And for a moment, a brief, flickering moment, I felt something like pity. Not for her, for the girl she used to be, the one I married. The one who used to light up when we drove down I-65 with the windows down and no plans. But she buried that girl next to the emails and the receipts and the baby that wasn't mine. I told her to call her pastor. Then I hung up. I didn't start over. Not really. People always love that idea. The fresh start, the clean slate. But the truth is, we don't start over. We carry the broken pieces into the next place and try to build something that doesn't rattle when we breathe. I moved to Huntsville, still Alabama, but far enough that nobody knew my name. Rented a 2-bedroom above a hardware store. Took only what mattered, a few tools, some paperwork, my dad's pocket knife, and an old photograph of me and my brothers from a fishing trip we took in '94. Back when things were simple, or at least before I knew how complicated they already were. Work kept me grounded. I took on more hands-on jobs again. I'd built those companies to run without me. But there's something about being elbow deep in machinery that quiets the part of your brain that won't shut up. Nights were quieter. No voices, no lies, no pretending. And then came the letter. It was from the pastor. Said he'd found God again. Said he was sorry for the pain he caused, that he'd been blinded by desire and pride. Claimed he'd lost everything. The church, the reputation, even his family. Said his wife had filed for divorce before the dust settled. I hadn't even known he was married. There was a sentence in the middle that caught me off guard. I understand now that I was not a shepherd. I was a wolf. I sat with that line for a long time. He wasn't asking for forgiveness exactly, just writing from a place where men go when their masks fall off and there's no one left to perform for. I respected the effort. I didn't respond. Some things deserve silence, but it stuck with me, because as much as I hated what he did, a part of me understood what it meant to fall short of who people think you are, to disappoint, to lose things you didn't realize you'd miss. The real shame? I used to believe in the church, not in the building, in the idea, community, accountability, purpose. Now, I flinch at the sound of hymns. That's what betrayal does. It rewires your senses. A few months after I moved, I ran into someone who knew her. It was at a diner off Highway 72, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tastes like it's been simmering since '98. I'd stopped in after a job, boots still muddy, shirt stuck to my back, just looking to kill time before traffic cleared. And there she was. Not my ex, but one of her old church friends, Denise. She didn't recognize me at first. I'd grown out the beard, put on some weight, and frankly, carried a different kind of energy, the kind you only get after everything you built has been kicked in and you're still standing anyway. But once she figured it out, the look in her eyes wasn't judgment. It was curiosity, like I was a ghost come back to haunt her social calendar. We chatted, politely. She asked how I was doing, the kind of question that feels loaded no matter how it's phrased. I kept it light, told her I was working, living quiet, nothing fancy. Then she lowered her voice and said something that stuck with me. We didn't know. Not until it was too late. I didn't ask what she meant. I just let her keep talking. People usually do when they think you're listening. Turns out, the church had known something was off with the pastor for a while. Whispers. Inconsistencies. A woman from another congregation had come forward about inappropriate counseling years earlier, but nothing ever stuck. He was charismatic, after all, a crowd pleaser, the kind of man who knew just when to cry and when to quote scripture. Denise told me my ex had tried to come back to the church recently, said she wanted to restore her walk. They told her no. Leadership felt she was still too close to the scandal, too volatile, too much baggage. And just like that, I saw the bigger picture. She didn't just lose a husband and a lover. She lost the stage, the audience, the identity that came from being the pastor's confidant, the respected woman of faith. Now she was just a woman with a baby and no anchor, no narrative. And I'll admit, a small part of me felt something close to justice. Not revenge. That's flashy, messy, emotional. This was cleaner, because it wasn't something I did to her. It was what she did to herself. The strangest part about survival is how normal it feels once it settles in. You'd think there'd be some triumphant music or a parade of relief, but there's not. One day, you just realize you haven't clenched your jaw in a while. You don't check your phone expecting chaos. You sleep through the night and wake up without that weight on your chest. That's how I knew I was healing. Not because I forgave her or moved on, but because I stopped waiting for the next blow. I spent a lot of time alone. Didn't date. Didn't reach out to old friends. The only company I kept was my own silence and the hum of broken compressors I fixed during the day. And that silence had a way of digging up things I'd buried. I started thinking about my father, about how he used to tell me that a man's worth isn't what he builds. It's what he protects. He said that once when I was 15, after catching me lying about something stupid, skipping school to fix a neighbor's air conditioner for 20 bucks. I told him I was just trying to help, and he looked at me and said, "Helping without truth isn't helping, it's hiding." At the time, I thought he was just angry. Now I think he was scared. Scared that I grow up thinking silence was strength. That swallowing pain was noble. That being this stable one meant being the one who never asked for anything. That's what I became with her. The stable one. The fixer. The man who never needed tending to. And the moment she realized that, she stopped pretending to care. That was the bitter root I couldn't dig out for months. Not that she cheated, but that she assumed I'd just take it. Quietly. Willingly. Like it was part of the job. Maybe that's on me. Maybe I taught her that I could endure anything, and she decided to test the theory. But I'm not a martyr. I'm just a man who finally said enough. And once I did, the world didn't fall apart. It got quieter. The day the letter from the court arrived, I didn't open it right away. I just stared at it sitting on the counter like a dead wasp, small, ugly, and holding more sting than size would suggest. It was from Jefferson County Family Court. I already knew what it was. Her petition to modify the custody and financial terms. She wanted more money. I made a sandwich instead. It wasn't hunger that made me do it. It was ritual, something normal to stand between me and the chaos she kept mailing in envelopes. Eventually, I opened it. She claimed hardship, said this support structure she'd relied on had evaporated. Her filing didn't name names, but I could hear her voice in every line, careful, victimized, spiritual in all the wrong places. She was now struggling to provide emotional and financial stability for the child. The child that, legally and genetically, wasn't mine. But the court didn't care about biology once that payment agreement had been stamped. As far as the state was concerned, I was the check that kept the lights on. I sat in that tiny apartment with the walls humming from the store compressors downstairs. And for the first time in months, I felt the weight creeping back. Like all that silence I'd built was paper thin and already tearing. I thought about fighting it. Thought about going back to court, hiring a lawyer, presenting new evidence. I still had the DNA results, the photos, the emails, hell, even an affidavit from the private investigator I never ended up using. But then I looked at the final line of her petition. This request is made in good faith and in the best interest of the child. That line hit different, because there was a child now. And none of this, not the betrayal, not the lies, not the scorched earth she left behind, was his fault. I didn't know his name, didn't know what he looked like, but I knew what it felt like to be a kid with no answers and too many questions. So instead of fighting, I made one call. My lawyer arranged a buyout, a final lump sum payment, signed and notarized, tied up with a bow. No more monthly checks. No more court dates. Just one last transaction and then silence. She'd said she wanted control. I gave her exactly that. Now she could finally stand on her own. Or fall. I thought that would be the end of it. That's the cruel trick of closure. You think it comes in one clean moment. One final payment, one slammed door, one envelope in the mail with a court seal on it. But closure doesn't come with paperwork. It creeps in quietly or not at all. Weeks passed, then months. I settled into a kind of routine, not happy but steady. Fixed HVAC systems by day, read the same 3 books over and over at night. I wasn't healing so much as hardening, like scar tissue where soft skin used to be. And then something strange happened. I got a voicemail from someone I didn't expect, the pastor's wife. Her voice was tired but steady. Said she had something for me, something I'd probably want to see. Left a number and an address in Tuscaloosa. I almost deleted it, but something in her tone, not urgency, not revenge, just gravity, made me write it down. I drove there the next weekend. The house was small, brick, with wind chimes that didn't move even in the breeze. She answered the door like she'd been watching for me all morning. We didn't say much. She just handed me a folder. Said, "He wrote these after everything fell apart. I think they were meant for you." Inside were handwritten letters, some torn from notebooks, others on church stationery, all from the pastor. The first one began with my name. Not brother, not friend, just my name. Clear, heavy. He confessed more than I expected. Affairs going back 10 years. Not just with my wife. Others. Sometimes women who came in for counseling. Sometimes members of the choir. Sometimes strangers who needed spiritual guidance. He wrote about power. About how people think temptation is loud and wild, but it's not. It's slow, patient, like a leak you ignore until the foundation caves in. He said he envied me. Not for the money. Not for the escape. But for the fact that, in the end, I had the guts to walk away from something broken, while he kept pretending it could be fixed. One line stopped me cold. "You got out." I stayed in the fire and told myself it was baptism. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the shadows to change across the room. When I finally looked up, she was sitting in the corner, watching me like someone who'd spent years watching things crumble. She didn't ask what I thought. She didn't offer tea or sympathy. She just said, "Now you know what he was." And I nodded, because I did. I didn't tell anyone about the letters. Not the lawyer, not my cousin who helped restructure the business. Not even my brother, who I talked to once a month just to remind each other we're still alive. I kept them in a fireproof box under my bed, not out of fear, but respect. They were the last words of a man who finally saw the wreckage he'd made and didn't look away. And maybe, in some backwards, broken way, that made him more honest than most. I never went back to Birmingham. Didn't see the point. The city didn't feel like mine anymore. Every street corner had history I didn't want to reread. Every familiar face was just another reminder of how much pretending I'd done. But one afternoon, I made a detour. I was driving back from a supplier in Decatur, took a long way home, ended up rolling down a side road out of habit. It wasn't until I saw the turnoff for Red Mountain that I realized where I was headed. Our old church, or what was left of it. The sign was gone. The parking lot cracked and empty. The playground out back had rust blooming across the slide like blood under skin. A for-lease banner hung from the front awning, limp in the wind. I didn't park, just sat there in the truck, engine humming like a soft warning. I thought I'd feel something, closure, maybe satisfaction, relief. But instead, I just felt quiet, like standing in a house where every picture's been taken off the wall. The whole place looked smaller than I remembered. Isn't that always the case with the things we once feared? You survive them, and suddenly they shrink. That night, I drove home with the windows cracked, letting in the smell of pine and road dust. It reminded me of those drives we used to take early in our marriage, when we'd talk about nothing and it felt like everything. Funny how a life can collapse under the weight of what people won't say. That's silence. That's what broke us more than the affair, more than the lies. We stopped being honest long before the truth showed up. You ever wonder if you were just a phase in someone else's life? Not a chapter, not a turning point, just a transitional moment they passed through on their way to something else. That's how I started to feel about my marriage, especially in those last few years, even before the affair surfaced. Looking back, there were signs. Not obvious ones. Just erosion. The way she stopped asking about my day. The way her compliments started sounding like obligations. The way the bedroom turned cold long before the betrayal ever did. It's strange how you can live beside someone for years and still be surprised when they leave, even when they've already been gone for a while. I started therapy after the buyout. Didn't tell anyone. Drove 2 towns over to make sure I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. The therapist was younger than me. Kind eyes, quiet voice. She didn't talk much. Just asked these questions that cracked open drawers I didn't know I'd sealed shut. She asked once if I ever grieved the life I thought I had. I told her no at first. Said I was too busy surviving to mourn. But later that night, I sat in the dark and stared at a photo I kept in my wallet. It was from a church picnic back when everything looked intact. I was holding a plate of ribs, she was laughing at something someone said off camera, and for a split second, just a flash frozen in ink, we looked like people who believed in what they were building. I cried for that. Not for her, not even for us, but for the version of me who still believed that love and loyalty meant the same thing. Grief has a way of hiding in strength. It dresses itself up as resilience, ambition, even anger. But underneath, it's just loss. Heavy, quiet, uninvited. I started writing again. Nothing fancy, just thoughts in a notebook. Some days it reads like a man trying to remember how to live. Other days like someone trying not to disappear. But it helps, because the story doesn't end just because the chapter does. I saw them once, her and the child. It was an accident. A grocery store off Memorial Parkway, middle of a Tuesday. I was reaching for a carton of milk when I glanced over and froze. There she was in the next aisle, scanning the shelves, pushing a cart with a toddler sitting sideways, fiddling with a broken keychain. He looked like her. Same tired eyes. Same tension in the mouth. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and chose not to react. Either way, I watched for just a few seconds, then turned and left without saying a word. I didn't feel anger, or grief, or satisfaction. Just a strange, hollow ache. Like watching someone live a life you might have been part of if things had gone differently. If you'd made one decision softer, or they made one less cruel. On the way home, I passed a church. Not the one we used to go to, that one's long gone. This one was small, with a banner that read, "You are not beyond repair." I laughed when I saw it, out loud. Not because I disagreed, but because of how much of my life had been shaped by people trying to pretend they weren't broken. Her, the pastor, even me for a long time. But that phrase stuck with me. Not beyond repair. I'm not there yet. Maybe I never will be. But I'm not where I was. Some nights, I sit out on the back porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the hum of the streetlights, and wondering if the quiet I fought so hard to build is the beginning of peace, or just the echo of survival. But then the breeze shifts, and I feel the air move around me like it's got space now. Like something was lifted. And in those moments, I don't miss her. I don't even miss the man I used to be. I just feel present. And that's enough.